Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the Prague Security Studies Institute lecture on the economic and financial dimensions of Russia's war in Ukraine. My name is Barbara Lechka, and I will be moderating today's lecture. I'm a project assistant at the economic and financial program here at PSSI. Before we start, I'd like to point out some technical issues. We have one speaker today, and the lecture will be followed by a Q&A session. For that session, you can post your questions in the Q&A box, and I will be reading them out loud during the Q&A session. So now it is my honor to welcome PSSI Chairman and Co-Founder Roger W. Robinson Jr. as our speaker today. Mr. Robinson began his career as a vice president in the international department of the Chase Manhattan Bank, New York City, with responsibility for Chase's lending activities in the Soviet Union, Central and Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia for 5 years. He also served as a personal assistant to then Chase chairman David Rockefeller. In early 1982, Mr. Robinson was appointed to the Senior Director of International Economic Affairs at the Reagan National Security Council, where, according to President Reagan, he was the architect of the secret economic and financial strategy for the takedown of the Soviet Union. He later served as a chairman of the Congressional U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission in the early 2000s for the bulk of his 5 years term. Mr. Robinson has concentrated on the nexus of national security and global finance for nearly 45 years and is one of the world's foremost experts in countering the economic and financial warfare activities of China and Russia. So it is my great honor to welcome Mr. Robinson here with us. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mr. Robinson.
Well, thank you very much, Bara. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today. A small disclaimer, the views that I'll be expressing today will be my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of all of my colleagues at PSSI. That said, I'd like to begin by taking us back in time. This is a longer story than it may appear, what's happening today, back to the late 70s and early 80s. At a time when the Soviet Union was massing troops on the Polish border. At that time, it looked like another invasion was taking place, like that took place against Hungary and the Czech Republic in '68 and so forth. Poland was at great risk, and the then president of Poland, General Jaruzelski, was given an ominous choice by Moscow, that is to either declare martial law and silence the Catholic Church, which was a dissident organization at the time, with John Paul II at the helm. And if he did not do so, to face the invasion forces. And of course, he dutifully did declare martial law, at which time President Reagan applied oil and gas equipment and technology sanctions against the then under construction twin strand Siberian gas pipeline project. Now, this was the largest project in East-West economic history by far. These were twin 3,600-mile pipelines from the Uruguay gas fields into the West European gas grid, if any of this sounds familiar to you. And the plan was that, that this pipeline by itself, this twin strand pipeline, would nearly double Soviet Union's hard currency earnings annually, which were a paltry $32 billion at the time, if you can believe it. And at the same time, increase West European dependency on Soviet gas to the tune of about 70 to 80%. Now, at the time, Germany and the rest of Europe was about 35% to 40% dependent on Soviet gas. If those numbers sound familiar to you, they're close to what's being used today. But very ominous development there. The president was persuaded, and in part I had a role in this, that, that this inordinate dependency of Western Europe on Soviet gas would be an instrument that they could use down the road to fundamentally erode the NATO alliance and create the kind of hostage taking and extortion scheme that we're witnessing today. All of this was anticipated, but had never taken place before. There was no such thing as pipeline politics, for example, and we had no precedents to help us persuade our European allies to step up with alternative, more secure sources of natural gas, because, of course, they would be somewhat more expensive than Soviet gas as well. So they'd be, in effect, facing a kind of economic penalty of a kind. So it was a very powerful disconnect took place between Western Europe and the United States, something that was hinted at early in this crisis when we saw our German friends seeking to protect Nord Stream 2, irrespective of the invasion, the second invasion of Ukraine. Fortunately, they've come around to a substantial degree since, but you can see the dynamic. It was much worse then because of the lack of any kind of precedent. And so what we were facing was a circumstance where the Soviets were intent on seeing this pipeline through, come hell or high water, not surprisingly. And we needed to identify quickly these alternative sources of oil and gas. The US had a monopoly on certain types of oil and gas equipment and technology at the time, something we don't have now, because of our drilling in the North Slope of Alaska. We could get through permafrost with our drill bits and all of those things that nobody else had at the time. So Western Europe was operating under US technology licenses in its supply of the Siberian gas pipeline, including rotors, compressors, turbines, and of course the Germans were providing the wide diameter pipe. So leave it to say that it was a very difficult situation. We got the Europeans, we thought, to pledge not to undermine US sanctions against the Soviets during this period of martial law, seeking to pressure them to release Poland from these debilitating strictures. And we were found out, to our disappointment, to say the least, that Western Europe immediately violated those pledges, and their companies took over what were US contracts that we forced our companies to forego. All of this may, again, sound somewhat familiar. So leave it to say that we had, again, a kind of monopoly on this type of equipment. We decided to go after the Soviet Union's hard currency cash flow about 6 months into martial law. The president had made clear that he expected progress on reconciliation with the Catholic Church, as well as ending what were taxpayer subsidized terms on Western credits, loans that were being used to finance the project. Again, taxpayer subsidized, below market loans. So Western taxpayers were paying for the privilege of giving the Soviet Union below market interest rates. That was yet another problem. And so we had in our hands here a very difficult situation, because there was no concurrence within the alliance of the best approach. The Europeans at the time believed that the Soviets would never use natural gas as a weapon and the cutoff of such gas, because it would make them an unreliable supplier. And they thought it would be a kind of shoot in the foot exercise. And they completely dismissed the notion of pipelines and natural gas supplies being weaponized by the Soviets against us. It was just, in our view, it was just a matter of when, not if. And so you can see this clash. It was one of the most bitter disputes in the history of the Atlantic Alliance. And it implicated a deal that was worth between 35 and 50 billion dollars, which was an enormous sum in the early 80s. And they were well down the road with the first strand of the Siberian gas pipeline, which is Nord Stream 1 today. So we weren't going to be able to stop the first strand, but we could delay it very substantially, which we ended up doing. And we could kill the second strand, which was supposed to be built after the first. Thank goodness, not simultaneously. And to give you a hint of how the story ends, we did kill that. And we did, at the end of the day, also have success in persuading the Saudis to pump 2 million barrels of oil more a day. That along with decontrolling prices of gas at the wellhead in the United States, caused a precipitous drop in the price of a barrel of oil to about $10 a barrel, as I recall. And for every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil, it was costing the Soviets $1 billion of annual hard currency earnings. And you can appreciate, how much that is when you were making 32 billion a year, which was equivalent to 1/3 of the annual revenues of Exxon at that time, or General Motors for that matter. So we were detecting a very weak hard currency cash flow in the case of the Soviets. And we thought we could use this leverage effectively. As it turned out, again, the alliance dispute was so bitter that it got to a point where the president had to expand our sanctions to include overseas licensees and subsidiaries. And that meant if you were operating under a US technology license, you couldn't sell those turbines, for example, to Moscow. And as it turned out, several European companies decided to go ahead and ignore the US sanctions, which they complained bitterly were extraterritorial in nature. That is the application of US law to what they felt were European companies operating under US license. They said that wasn't cricket at all. And so we had to actually implement so-called import controls against about half a dozen major West European companies. Now, import controls are the closure of the US markets entirely, and financial as well as goods and services. We talk about, the SWIFT issue being a kind of economic or financial nuclear weapon. Well, import controls does that one better. It's a debilitating sanction, and about all but 2 of those companies went under within 6 months of losing the US market. We basically gave them a choice. You can service the Soviet market, or you can service the American market, but you're not going to do both. Now that's Reagan resolve in an epic way, it seems to me. It is so reflective of his attitude during this period. It took a lot of courage to take a stand that firmly when, again, we didn't have any precedent or history to prove definitively that Moscow would be nefarious enough to weaponize natural gas and pipelines of this kind. So leave it to say that we brought the Europeans around in November of 1982. The epilogue of this crisis was we established a 30% ceiling on Soviet natural gas deliveries to Western Europe as a percentage of total West European supplies, 30%. My friend Bill Martin had a lot to do with that over at the International Energy Agency, where we secured that deal. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD at the time, ended subsidized credit terms for the Soviets. They moved them from one category to another category that effectively eliminated the taxpayer underwriting loans from Western governments to the Soviet Union. And we tightened technology controls in the multilateral export control regime, COCOM at the time, as it was called. And of course, we had a debilitating impact on Soviet hard currency earnings. We delayed the first pipeline about 3 years, and that cost the Soviets about 15 billion a year. And the second strand was never built and is reflected in Nord Stream 2 today, some 40 years later. So it's very important, it seems to me, for folks to understand that we've been to this rodeo before. We've seen this movie before. And I can tell you that it took this kind of horrific, brutal invasion and human rights abuses that are just off the chart to finally persuade our European friends that this inordinate dependency, this stranglehold of the Russians on West European gas has to end. I mean, it's just tragic that the legacy of the Siberian gas pipeline was not followed. Helmut Schmidt was Chancellor of Germany at the time. Francois Mitterrand was President of France. And I don't know how you could put it differently, but they basically spit in the face of President Reagan, as did Hans Dietrich Genscher, then German foreign minister, and a host of other individuals. And it was a very bitter episode. And here we are today with all of these measures that were taken, validated, sadly, and vindicated. And now it's in a sense too late. We find ourselves in a huge scramble to Qatar, and recently even the US to Venezuela, to Iran, Algeria. Everyone's looking for gas. Everyone's looking for oil in this melee, this scramble to offset Russian oil and gas deliveries to Western Europe. A very sad, even pathetic circumstance, given all the blood on the floor, rhetorically speaking, that was in this heated, very unpleasant and conflicted dialogue between European allies in the early 1980s. But I'll just say in closing, and as we move on to the current situation, had there been no Ronald Reagan, it is no exaggeration to say we would be dealing with 80% West European dependency on Russian gas, not 40+%. And you can see the near disaster being faced today at 40-ish%. Just imagine where we would be at 80%. Now, is anybody going to thank Ronald Reagan for that? No. Does anybody remember or write about this? No. Which is a sad fact itself. But I wasn't going to have this occasion come and go and folks to think that this entire exercise, which consumed 2 years of alliance relations, never happened, and we never got the kind of results that we were looking for. We did, and Ronald Reagan and the Reagan administration is to thank for that. And I feel very privileged to have been in the midst, in the very epicenter of that 2-year struggle. So I'll just leave it there, and we'll fast forward to the current circumstance. Now, looking at sanctions as they are configured today against Russia, I think the things that impress me the most are the central bank sanctions, which really resulted in essence, the weaponization of the dollar and the euro, and denying the use of those currencies by the Russians to offset inflation and to prevent that money, or at least a good slug of it, from financing this dastardly military conflict. And that was a very important step that I think was terribly chilling for the Chinese. They rely inordinately themselves on annual massive dollar financing to maintain anything near the growth rate that they're projecting. Again, the ruble's a non-convertible currency then and now. The Chinese yuan is a non-convertible currency, at least we forget. They can try to displace the dollar all they want, but I'll guarantee you for our children's children's children, I don't see them making a dent in that dependency. The dollar is riding strong. It is the gold standard. It is the place of refuge in very trying, desperate times like we're facing in Europe today. We can see the dollar strengthening by the day against European currencies, for example. So I think that that was an awfully big deal to take hundreds of billions of dollars out of the war chest of Russia and to park it frozen on the sidelines. SWIFT, well, it's a selective set of sanctions on SWIFT. It is very disruptive. I'll buy into that. But oil and gas is largely exempt. Well, that's, 2/3 of their annual revenue or so, maybe 50% plus of their revenue, probably 2/3 of their exports. And those are roughly the same numbers that existed in the early 80s. It's just amazing, the parallels. And the Russian economy never diversified. It was the petrol station that it is today. So if you look at the technology controls, those are very welcome in terms of denying Moscow the kind of semiconductors, advanced technologies needed to fuel a modern economy. I think that will be very telling over time, nothing immediate. But if you look at the capital markets, which I spend a lot of my time on, what do you see there? Well, you see that Russia's sovereign bonds that have been denied any kind of new issuances. So you're not able to issue new Russian bonds. But of course, in the midst of a war, that wasn't going to happen anyway. So what about the existing Russian bonds in the portfolios of scores of millions of US and European retail investors in their portfolios right now? The answer is nothing. They can trade those bonds with impunity. All of that secondary market activity, as it's called, should have been curtailed and still must be curtailed, in my view. If you look at 8 of Russia's largest companies like Gazprom, Lukoil, Novatek, Rosneft, Sberbank, VEB, all of them were sanctioned for the 2014 invasion. Half of those 8 companies were also on the entity list of the Department of Commerce today, meaning that they are denied Western equipment and technology because of their egregious national security and human rights abuses. So half of the companies are under 2 layers of US sanctions today, and the other 4 are under OFAC, Treasury Department sanctions, again, for the invasion in 2014. What happened to them? Well, similar to bonds, you can't have new debt and equity issuances. Well, those weren't going to happen anyway. But what about those stocks in particular? They're still in the portfolios of the American people and the European investors. No change. They're raising money. They have all the prestige of being traded in the world's most voluminous and deep capital markets in the world. That is the US capital markets, which are, in terms of their size and depth, roughly equivalent to the rest of the world's combined. The US has about 66% of the world's liquidity, and we utterly dominate the global financial domain. And for that matter, the global economic and financial domain. So we're in a very unusual position. When I talked about earlier in the early 80s, our global monopoly on oil and gas equipment and technology, the type that can drill through permafrost and extract, process, and transmit natural gas from Siberia to the West European gas grid, something we have no more. What is our whole card? What is our global advantage today, that special kind of near monopoly? And the simple answer is the money. We have the money. And China and Russia have to have that money. Again, non-convertible currencies here, something to keep in mind. So when I look at the crisis, and then we'll open it as soon as I can for questions and answers. The biggest problem I see is, and I think probably many of you share this view, is where's the off-ramp for Putin? We've seen how capable he is of a level of brutality that is reminiscent of the Third Reich. It's almost unbelievable that we're witnessing this take place on the continent of Europe in 2022, as has been often observed by folks. And he's bound and determined to take Ukraine, circling, leveling towns, cities, indiscriminate bombing of civilians, all those things that have had people in Western capitals on the streets, thank goodness. All of us have taken the Ukrainian cause into our hearts. Many of us are wearing the Ukrainian colors if we can find them. But of course we're constrained. It's not just the non-NATO membership. It's this natty issue of avoiding a nuclear war. And I don't see necessarily right now the end game. Now, the two largest dangers in my mind, I think are also probably self-evident to many of you, but it's worth talking about, which is one, as the economic and financial sanctions bite and Putin starts to realize that the walls are closing in the economic and financial portfolio. I think it was today he declared that the US had declared economic war on Russia. Well, of course, those are strong words. And we've seen nuclear saber rattling already on at least a couple of occasions, as well as Foreign Minister Lavrov. It's terribly worrying. And now we have the choreography, if you will, of the Polish MiG-29s and going over to Ramstein, and now there's a kind of hot potato feeling about who's going to deliver the planes. The US is, I think, justifiably fearful of the implications of their doing so. The Poles are not keen to be in the crosshairs of Moscow in this kind of highly unpredictable environment of vicious belligerence. And so as the resupplies take place of javelins, stingers, maybe even, I hope, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, is it a matter of time until Moscow starts to see those as NATO becoming combatants and belligerents in this war? So there are two ways that this thing could go really wrong off the rails and we could start to see, again, saber rattling of a different type and even detect movement in tactical nuclear weapons or something truly monstrous and scary of that kind. Putin could be deposed, a possibility, but it's a hard call as to the level of likelihood. Or a neutral Ukraine and somehow Ukraine is ceding to Eastern Ukraine falling under Russian control. These are, it's a kind of a long shot in the sense that I don't see Zelensky accepting such a thing. There's even a rumor that Zelensky himself might be spared and could remain head of state in Western Ukraine. But again, your guess is as good as mine in some ways as to the likelihood of this. So I'm very concerned about it, as we all are. Just a quick word about China, and then we'll get to Q's and A's. The Chinese made a breathtaking error, something that President Xi is very good at, thank goodness, which was to, during the Winter Olympics, sign up to a 5,000 word declaration with Moscow, a so-called no limits Axis power pact. That's what I think of it as. That has eerie similarities to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And at the very moment when the world opprobrium came down like a ton of bricks on Putin, China joined them at the hip in, again, a no limits agreement on cooperation. Now, China is starting to backpedal fairly furiously, in my opinion. It's occurred to them that that was a very unfortunate intelligence failure on their part. I don't think they thought Putin was going to go in necessarily. If they did, they wanted him to wait post-Olympics, as we know, which makes them complicit in the violence. But I don't think that they saw the effort to take all of Ukraine. I don't think so, because China is going to pay a debilitating price for this. I think that's clear. And if they are subject to secondary sanctions, that is, Chinese companies that step in to cushion, offset, or contravene the impact of Western sanctions on Russian companies, hopefully they're going to face bipartisan veto-proof legislation in the US Congress that applies or imposes debilitating secondary sanctions on those companies, including those that are publicly traded being denied access to the US capital markets, and to make it illegal for American persons to be holding the stocks and bonds of those sanctioned companies. Now, if something like that happened, if you think that China's backpedaling now, they would be headed for the tall grass at some velocity if this happened, because they're not anxious to have an unraveling of their relationship with the dollar, which is an utter dependency. And also, they have to have access to the US capital markets. There's nowhere else to go for them. And so I think we can make the costs very high for China. Anybody who thought China was going to waltz in and take over this thing for the Russians and in effect make them well and insulate them from the harshness of some of the sanctions in play right now should think again. There's not going to be a free lunch for China. And so that's why they've made a big mistake, in my humble view. And my final comment would be what I call a kind of information Dunkirk. You know, for those students of World War II, there was this inexplicable delay in Hitler's armor and its columns of troops that were headed for the 300,000 Brits and French on the beaches of Dunkirk. He used the time to consolidate his forces. He left the task to Goering and the Luftwaffe, which said that they could decimate the beach, which they failed to do. And that inexplicable delay permitted 300,000 plus soldiers to escape to the UK and fight another day. One of the truly great episodes in our favor in the Second World War. Now, what is an information Dunkirk? Well, Moscow needed to turn off the lights and cameras in Kiev within 48 to 72 hours like they had planned. The fact that we've seen this stunning shortfall in military capabilities and planning and logistics, the fact that we're still hearing from all of the reporters, with the exception of towns that are truly in extremis like Mariupol and others, is remarkable. And we've seen, all of us, hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews of tragedy beyond imagination, of terminally ill children, et cetera, right to these stories of bravery and courage that will make the annals of history. And we've seen the plight up close and personal of the Ukrainian people, their resolve, their courage, but also their destitution and the losses, these horrible scenes. And it's galvanized the world. And that is what's driving our sanctions regimes today. And any hope that the Ukrainians have is spurred on by their own stories being broadcast to the world. So I don't know whether it'll ever be called Information Dunkirk or not. I'm not wedded to trying to name anything, but I will tell you that this is an extraordinary mistake by the Kremlin, for which they will not recover. And their names of these individuals, including Putin, will be blackened in history appropriately. So I'm now going to turn it back over to you folks for questions, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robinson, for your thoughts. And I would like to encourage everybody to type their questions in the Q&A box. And we actually already have a couple of questions, so I'll start off. Do you think that a peace negotiation between Ukraine and Russia is a likely outcome?
Well, it's either that or an escalation, I'm sad to say, or at least the saber rattling of tactical nuclear weapons, and possibly even DEFCON equivalent statuses of nuclear alert strategically, ICBM type of thing. And we have to pray for a negotiated solution, but it's going to be dependent, it seems to me, on Ukraine feeling the comfort level to declare neutrality and also to, in effect, sacrifice much of Eastern Ukraine. My thoughts and prayers, of course, are with Zelensky and his team, like all of ours are, and his survival is absolutely key. Although nothing can change the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainian people, with or without Zelensky. But let's pray that he stays in place. So I think that it's possible that if the brave people of Russia can continue to go out into the streets and show their disgust with the Kremlin and their own bitterness as to the plight of their compatriots in Ukraine, if they can show that empathy, which many have courageously done despite harsh prison sentences, thousands arrested, they're being brutalized. That's our hope, is the Russian people, to a large extent. And if Putin feels that he's losing control of not just the economic and financial dimensions of Russia, but also the Russian people and the collection of all the goodies of the oligarchs, their yachts, their villas, their townhouses, and automobiles and the like, that too could be a very useful pressure point, because a lot of those monies are Putin's, under their care. That I buy. So we do have hope of a negotiated solution, I suppose. But if you look at Putin himself, it's a twisted situation. Is he terminally ill? Don't know. Is he deranged? In my view, yes. Is there a different Putin here than those that have dealt with him in the past have ever seen? They say so. But if there's anything really wrong with this guy, this is the kind of individual that tries to take down Western civilization with him. And that's the greatest concern. Obviously, I want the nuclear side of this taken off of the table as quickly as possible. And that, again, remains my greatest concern if we can't find a negotiated way out of this thing.
Thank you. Another question asks, how long do you think that Russian gold reserves can help Putin fund the war? How long can he run with that?
It's a good question. I've seen different numbers applied to the burn rate, as they say in the financial trade, of what a war costs. I've seen everything from 2 billion, I think one was a typo that said 20 billion a day. 2 billion sounds more like it to me. But nevertheless, I don't know precisely what they have in gold. Probably 150 to 200 billion is my guess. And it goes, it can go pretty quickly when you have the tempo of a military operation of this scale. And it's becoming protracted. I mean, we're 2 weeks in. It's just amazing to me, the staying power of Ukraine, like it is to all of us. And it is burning up cash. And they do have to increasingly turn to gold because of the weaponization of the dollar and euro and freezing a good slug of those reserves in place. So my guess would be, it's weeks before you could get into some financial extremis, even on the gold front. Maybe a month, but I have a hard time envisioning this cataclysmic situation going on for another 30 days. But, it's not that long is the answer.
Another question asks, do you see the sanctions as having a disproportionate impact on Russia's ethnic republics? And could this lead to greater moves for succession within Russia?
I have to confess, I hadn't studied the regional impacts in Russia. I accept to know that troops are being moved from the Far East into this. And that means body bags for them too. So I can't speak to the economics of it, frankly, at this juncture. I'm kind of looking at the centralized picture on a more holistic basis at this time, as you might imagine. But I do think in general that as these companies, there's an organic nature to this whole thing now. It doesn't matter if it's official sanctions of the EU, NATO countries, or the US for that matter, unilaterally. These companies are dropping out by the dozens, household name companies, because of the damage to brand and corporate reputation that's going to happen. Even calloused operations like MSCI and FTSE Russell have dropped Russia from their indices. They're happy to keep aiders and abettors of genocide, slave labor, the surveillance state, and equipping concentration camps of the Chinese companies. All of them are welcome. But they did bail from Russia. And that tells you something. Of course, Russia being a much smaller player economically, cynically probably explains that, right? China's too big a customer, so they can walk It would be interesting to see if they even drop them out in an invasion of Taiwan. So, but I'm trying to make a point that there's an extraordinary exit of companies that impact the day-to-day lives of the Russian people. Everything from McDonald's to Netflix to MasterCard and Visa process 74% of their payments. Now, do we really think that Union Pay out of Beijing, combined with Russia's dilapidated mirror issue, can offset that? No. Do we think that China's CIPS, CIPS, it's kind of a clearinghouse international payments, interbank payment system, which processes about 39,000 or 135,000 transactions a day. How do you compare that to SWIFT that's doing 40 million a day? In other words, China can't offset that. So the Russian people, you know, you've seen the lines at the ATM machines. That's going to look like the good old days real soon. And as they realize that they're being vilified as individuals, when they realize that the world is going to turn against them individually, even though it might be unfair, they're going to get the picture the hard way that the Kremlin, by moving off into a fascist war machine reminiscent of the Third Reich, if they end up living with that, they're going to pay beyond their imaginations right down to the individual. And that is probably the best hope in this whole show, this sickening, sad show.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions which I'll basically ask if other rich countries such as China, not only China, but Qatar, United Arab Emirates, decide to support Russia, if the US will put similar sanctions against these countries as well.
Well, they would be brain dead to do so. Let's start with that. And they would be the most politically tone deaf countries in the world by definition. Qatar will probably try to make money off of this deal in terms of being an offset to Russian gas, would be my guess. UAE is not, best I know, brain dead, even though they've equivocated, like has India, sadly, in this crisis, in this war. The Saudis are not helping in terms of at least offsetting the prices at the pump in both the US and Europe. Obviously, the Biden administration is not unlocking US energy, which is a huge issue here in the United States. Just in disbelief that you go to Venezuela and Iran before you go to Texas and our other oil producing states and our shale gas and all of that. But that's a lecture for another day. So I think it's possible that any country or company that provides material assistance to Russia in, as I said, in cushioning or contravening Western sanctions against Russian companies is going to pay a price. The Congress is not going to sit by, again, any more than they are for China, and watch some free lunch for Russia taking place elsewhere, in my view.
So next question asks if you think that the kind of united stance of European countries is short-lived, or if you think that this unity can be sustained.
Well, if a lesson of this scale doesn't galvanize Europe and move them in a new direction in terms of Russian energy dependency this time, which obviously the imminent invasion of Poland didn't do in the early 1980s, by the way, And if you can go through this level of carnage and come back and think that, maybe we can kind of restart Nord Stream 2. What a pathetic display. What a horrifically callous move that would be. Everybody would be looking at Germany, you can bet. Everybody thinks that it's within their capacity not to sustain the current resolve. And why? Because of the decades and decades of equivocation, middle diplomat, playing footsie with the Russians. I mean, look at their defense spending. I mean, we all can, I'll try to say something positive. We can all celebrate a page turned in Germany. And let's just hope that it's sustainable. But I'll tell you something, they're going to pay a price if they try to revert back to form. And the French too, they fancied they were going to be middle diplomat here. Oh, it worked out really well for President Macron, huh? So I think Europe is in a reset. And it's been a searing, avoidable, horrific situation that has endangered all of us with a madman at the helm of over 6,000 nuclear weapons. There's nothing okay about that. And none of us see any daylight in that. So I do expect, albeit begrudgingly, Europe not just turns a new page, but starts a new book. That's my answer.
So another question is asking basically what China wants in exchange for its support. What can China expect to get, or what does it want to get?
It wants ever better and more complete intelligence sharing. It wants ever more sophisticated access to Russia's top line weapon systems. And and of course they want discounted, privileged access to Russian energy. Now, those are not necessarily in order of priority. You could easily put energy, weapons, intelligence is more like it. And weapons and energy are, vying for the top, in my view. But that's the big payoff there. And they certainly aren't going to be making PR, public relations points with their new Axis power partnership with Moscow, unless you want to sign on to a world pariah some 2 weeks before they become a world pariah. Gee, what a great idea. What a visionary move of President Xi, right? Just like he lost $1.5 trillion of the American people's money on his capriciousness on technology companies last summer. Another really visionary move, right? So the point being that anybody who thinks that China is going to be prospering here, like they did in COVID, in the view of some, and they're going to kind of catapult off of this thing as we're distracted and, basically hobbled in Europe, they should think again. These guys are not 10 feet tall, and they have a very weak underpinnings of that economy. We just look at the real estate crisis, look at their debt structure, and the debt burden, for God's sake. Look at the provinces, how impoverished they are. I could give you a couple of hours right now on the Chinese economy quite happily to demonstrate to you that anybody who thinks that these guys are going to be using this as a springboard for a better tomorrow for Chinese military power and power projection needs to think again. This has been a disaster for China. And if they harbor a different view, they'll find out how wrong they are pretty darn soon.
Another interesting question asks if you think that the sanctions that were imposed are tough enough to force the oligarch and other high-level people in Russia to push against the war, and how much they are actually losing because of these sanctions.
Well, as I said, I love the idea that the US and Europe are going granular now. That is to say, they're going after specific homes, specific yachts, specific townhouses, jets, cars. You know, it speaks to the oligarchs. And it's a very good move. But at the same time, I mean, is the Secretary of Treasury of the U.S. and the Chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission, are they arguing to insulate Russia from capital market sanctions, to protect Wall Street fees, or even if it's to protect American investors from losses of having to exit those positions quickly? Well, yes, in my view. I mean, you don't have to look that hard to find instances where our resolve is lacking. And by the way, that's a pretty kind way to put it. And that we have more room to tighten the screws. I mean, look at oil and gas. I mean, look at the SWIFT exceptions. They're glaring. I mean, look at what it took to have President Biden, I'm sorry, go ahead and finally declare a ban on Russian oil deliveries to the US. I mean, you know, we are still slow on the draw. And we're trying to preserve what we can of these relationships when, frankly, we should be all in. We're not all in. I mean, if you just take a look at it technically, it's a fact. I mean, how do we explain scores of millions of retail American investors holding Gazprom stock, and as they say, Rosneft, Lukoil, Sberbank, VEB, Novatech, and I'm just naming a few. I mean, what's up with that? We didn't want their oil because, of course, we're financing the war machine, but it's okay if they raise money in our capital markets, cash. You know, these are the kind of questions that have to be asked. And we put out a paper on this at PSSI recently, and I recommend that folks go to our website and take a look, because it'll tell you this story in greater granular detail. But there's more that can be done, and no, we are not anywhere near having put it to Russia the way we can.
So another question asks if you think that if negotiations with Saudis on oil supplies go through, if these supplies would be sufficient for the U.S.
Well, 2 million barrels a day would probably do it. Yeah, I mean, after all, with the fungibility of oil, you know, it's just into the market. You know, it's not like Saudi oil. You can put a designator on it and watch it flow to the US. If we raise global oil production, which is the net effect here that we're looking for, yes, I mean, we have the ability to get out of this thing and get Europe squared away for next winter. As you know, they can muddle through the rest of the year and right up almost to the fall. It's next winter that's the problem. So this is not an immediate thing. But can we work that problem? Sure. Could Qatar help us here? Yes, as could a number of other suppliers. It would be a nice touch if President Biden would stop impeding our LNG leases and licenses. LNG terminals, they take years to build. Did Europe begin that building? In some select ways, yes, but basically no. There's no LNG platform, to my knowledge, or receiving station in Germany, right? Gee, what elevated planning, you know? Gee, they really got a good handle on contingencies, right? Sorry to be sarcastic, but it's indicated.
There is actually a follow-up question. Will the US stop oil exports this year?
Will the US stop oil exports? I mean, I don't see it necessarily. I think so much is contingent on ending the war in the United States on fossil fuels. I mean, climate change and the green revolution have hijacked US oil and gas production. And that's a sad thing. You don't have to be against climate change to recognize that renewables aren't going to get you there, obviously, and that fossil fuels have a role to play. Witness the fact that we're taken hostage in a war on the continent of Europe. This is the biggest thing that's happened since World War II. We got over 2 million people going to 4 million people that are streaming into Western Europe for their lives and their children's lives. What does it take? You know, I mean, that's just my question, to wake up and smell the coffee and to make these changes. It's within our capacity to do it. And I think these horrific scenes are going to be the impetus for us to do it.
Another question, can we expect the Russian economy to collapse if they do not capture Kiev? And is it possible that Putin will run out of patience and erase Ukraine from the map with artillery shelling?
Well, we're in a kind of foot race, aren't we? Sadly. I mean, how many Ukrainian cities will be turned into rubble prior to, as this medieval surround and destroy strategy plays out, versus the seizure of the economic gears of Russia that are no longer lubricated by Western capital flows, technology, and markets. Unfortunately, economic and financial strictures take some time. And it takes time to empty gold accounts and time to empty reserve accounts. And it's time we don't have. The folks in Mariupol didn't have water, don't have water, much less electricity. I mean, every day is torture and death. So that part's not looking good. I mean, that's why the Russian people hitting the streets might be our best near-term fix for this thing, if they can react if they can learn the truth, number one, and react with revulsion, number two, quickly, and demonstrate that Putin himself is witnessing a complete evaporation of support among his oligarchs, among his military high command, and very importantly, average Russian citizens. So barring that, there's going to be more Mariupols, and we're going to see Kiev itself in extremis in how long? 48, 72 hours? I mean, this is not, this is a next week thing. This is a now thing, as President Zelensky has made very poignantly clear in his Churchillian comportment in the life of this unbelievable cataclysm. So that would be, it's a little bit of a convoluted answer, but that's it.
Another interesting question is asking if the Ukraine-Russia war is masking an Iranian nuclear deal.
Well, it's no coincidence that you see that on fast forward behind closed doors in the dead of night. So yes, I mean, I don't think that the Biden administration's wild about Congress looking over the details of what he's agreeing to in terms of lifting sanctions against Iran, the billions, tens of billions that are going to flow to them, the Revolutionary Guard possibly being taken off of the terrorism list, all kinds of sanctioned companies and individuals going free, as it were. And the fact that we're still going to be looking at a 6 to 7 month breakout window toward a nuclear weapon, where once upon a time we had a year. I mean, sadly, right after the Ukrainian crisis, we were looking for an Iran crisis, because these guys are dedicated to securing a nuclear weapon and declaring themselves a nuclear state. How much time do we have? You know, a year, if we're lucky. And then, you know, what about China and Taiwan? And not to mention Kim Jong-un, who wants to test ICBMs every day, if he could. But, you know, we do have multiple crises. And sadly, they're born of the lack of Reagan's peace through strength. Put simply, they're born of weakness, vacillation, and perceived permissiveness. Is it fair? I'm not going to claim that it is all fair, but each individual has to make a choice. I mean, make a decision on that for themselves. I have views on the matter, which you could probably guess, but I'll leave it to everybody else to think about. Does weakness breed contempt? The answer's, I think, historically speaking, is yes. And are we experiencing an emboldenment of the world's adversaries in the window of first the Obama-Biden administration, now the Biden administration? I don't mean to be political about it, but at the same time, you know, did that happen under Jimmy Carter? Yes. I mean, did it happen under Ronald Reagan? No. So folks have to make their own decision. I'm not going to get into the political dimensions too much here.
We have two more interesting questions. One is, if we are hopeful and Ukraine comes out as the victor, do you think that Russia will face financial compensations or reparations in the aftermath?
Well, they certainly should. And free energy would be one way. But I think that Russia itself is going to be a pretty wounded entity by the time this thing's over, and you're not going to be able to squeeze much hard currency out of that place for reparations. I think, sadly, it's going to be a Western undertaking, an alliance-wide undertaking, hopefully with other nations of good faith and who are flush, helping out. I even think you'll have the Taiwanese helping out. You'll have all kinds of people. Japan, there'll be numbers of people that are chiming in, already have, in terms of foregoing, in the case of Japan, their own oil supplies and dedicating them to Western Europe and so forth. In other words, there's a world of goodwill for Ukraine and its suffering. Thank goodness. And this is not playing out in the dead of night, like the Iranian deal is now. So I think we can get it together for sure to make a major reconstruction of Ukraine happen over time, of course. But the Russians, they'll have their own problems to recover from when this show closes. Again, you know, we just have to avoid the nuclear saber rattling, much less the use of tactical or strategic nuclear weapons, or this thing goes to hell completely. And we're in, yet again, a new world. I already think we're in a new world in the sense that there was the world pre-Ukraine invasion and there's the world post Ukraine invasion. I think it's that big a demarcation line. After all, Russia and China were not necessarily Axis powers prior to this time. You could call them strategic competitors and all the stuff you want to call them, adversaries, but this is different. I mean, when you start to get into comparisons with Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, etc., you're in another league. And we can't forget that China has aided and abetted Moscow at every turn.
So a final question is, do you think that the EU should cut off Russian oil and gas imports?
I do. And Russia might end Nord Stream 1 even before we get around to that view in their own effort to penalize us. But yes, I do. Even though there would be hardships and so forth, I think it's time to step up and take that next very difficult step and work the problem in a crisis environment to offset those supplies. But I think that last lever of massive earnings for Putin's war machine, that last lever for extortion, outright mafioso type behavior, should end now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robinson, for spending time with us, for all your interesting facts and thoughts. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you to all the participants for their interesting questions. Finally, I would like to thank the US Embassy in Prague for their support for this event. So it was a pleasure to have you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.